Installing Linux these days is a relatively easy process, for the most part. I recently documented my first disastrous experience of installing SuSE Linux 5.2 on our family's first PC from 1996, which almost put me off Linux for life. And I've spent some time reacquainting myself with the installer, and it got me thinking, when did the first user-friendly Linux come about? Well, that's what we're going to find out in today's video, right after a quick message from PCBWay. Any day you get a package from PCBWay is a good day. In a previous video I said I'd have to manufacture a way to hold an SD to IDE adapter, but PCBWay had my back. I simply uploaded this 3D model of a bracket and PCBWay did the rest. And look at these. They don't look 3D printed at all. The quality is outstanding and I couldn't be happier. Not only do they offer 3D printing services, but many others, including PCB prototyping, fabrication, CNC machining, and even sheet metal fabrication. From September 1st, enjoy increasing discounts on TPU FDM prints. The heavier you print, the bigger the saving. And if you want to add a vibrant touch to your PCB projects, choose Purple Solder Mask at no extra cost, free also until the end of September. And finally, join PCBWay's 8th Design Contest, which runs from September the 1st, 2025 to January the 31st, 2026. Full details, themes, and how to enter, check the link below. And thanks as always to PCBWay for your continued support of this channel. If you haven't watched it, I'll leave a link in the description below. But a quick recap of what happened. Our family PC from 1996 was a fairly generic PC, nothing too special, but with the enthusiasm of a 16-year-old me, I thought I'd go about installing Linux that I'd received on a cover CD from PC Plus's magazine in October of 1998. I figured it might take me a couple of hours to install, but we'll just say that things didn't pan out as I expected, and what I initially thought might be a couple of hours turned into a several-day ordeal, where I was still futzing around trying to get my PC into a usable state. In disgust, I reformatted the hard drive and reinstalled Windows 95 from the system restore media and almost vowed never to go back. A few other Linux distributions crossed my path, from Red Hat Linux 5.2, Corel Linux, and even Mandrake Linux, but I'd been burned and I really didn't want to try again. Despite Mandrake's goal of making Linux more approachable to people who were coming from Windows, most other distributions at the time had fairly technical, text-heavy installers that expected users to know things like partitioning, X server settings and hardware details. Mandrake's approach was different, and it had a graphical setup called DrakeX, and it used that where possible instead of relying purely on text-based prompts. Mandrake was also hardware-friendly and tried to auto-detect sound cards, graphics cards and monitors, which was a big deal in the late 90s when manual configuration was the norm. Early versions even included utilities to shrink a Windows partition safely and dual boot, something that intimidated a lot of users back then. Some people have described it as their first successful Linux install after failing with others. At the time, I was really only experienced with macOS and Windows 95 installers, which compared to Linux were vastly simpler than what I'd been through with SuSE. The Mac had no concept of command line interface and could boot off a CD-ROM. This loaded the familiar macOS interface and had graphical tools for formatting and partitioning your computer's hard drive. And it had a nice easy to use installer that allowed you to customize the install as you saw fit. With Macs, there's no installation of drivers necessary either. You do the install, reboot, and you're up and running. Now Windows 95, and I'm going to skip Windows 3.x here as I bypassed it, also had quite an easy installer. Admittedly, yes, you are required to partition and format your hard disk in DOS, but the process is relatively straightforward. The installer for Windows, once the hard drive bit is out of the way with, is also graphical and easy to understand, which also makes it a breeze to customize your install. It's not as smooth as the macOS install and requires a couple of reboots, but I much prefer this over any Linux install. Well, up to that point anyway. Towards the end of the 90s, the versions of Linux available on cover CDs were still relatively early versions in the life of Linux. Remember, it had only been released in 1991, whereas the macOS, or system software, had been out for almost a decade at that point. But the Linux installers still weren't user-friendly. But all this changed in September of 2002, when Red Hat Linux 8 was released. This was a turning point that made many other Linux distributions quickly follow. Red Hat had been using its own text-based installer. It wasn't branded with any special name, but most people referred to it as the Red Hat installer. But that changed from version 6.1, which was a transition point, and this version introduced Anaconda, the new graphical installer. It simplified partitioning, package selection, and hardware detection. And for many people, myself included, this was the first time that the Linux installer felt approachable. Red Hat 8 was positioned as a desktop OS for regular users, not just servers or sysadmins, and came with modern applications like OpenOffice.org instead of StarOffice, the Mozilla web browser, the Evolution email client, and many more. The much-hyped desktop theme, Blue Curve, not only looked nice, what with its nice anti-aliased fonts via FreeType, icons and colour schemes, but it aimed to unify the look of GNOME and KDE with a consistent, polished user interface. However, in a small part of the Linux world, it was seen as being controversial, as some KDE devs weren't happy. They felt Blue Curve overrode KDE's visual identity and style. It made Linux feel slick and professional, more like Windows or Mac OS. It was Red Hat 8 that persuaded me to take another shot at Linux, and it was much more successful than I was before. I'd moved back to the Mac at this point, and although Red Hat 7.1 had a PowerPC port, I didn't fancy trying it on my iMac. Also, our family PC didn't meet the minimum system requirements for Red Hat. The CPU was only 100 MHz, although 90 MHz or above was recommended. But really, you needed at least 166 MHz or above for decent performance. A minimum of 64 MB of RAM was required, or 128 if you planned on using a GUI. Not only did our machine lack RAM, but it also lacked disk space. 2 GB was recommended as a minimum, but more would be required depending on the packages you chose to install. So I tried it on another machine I managed to get my hands on. This was a much more powerful machine, and the install went smoothly. Within about 30 minutes I was looking at a desktop that had a strange mix of familiarity and unfamiliarity. What I especially liked was the graphical package manager tool that lets users select predefined package groups or individual applications in an easy-to-use graphical interface, making it much more user-friendly than trying to manually install them via the command line. And of course it was also just as easy to uninstall an application this way too. The standard install came with numerous useful applications, but as with my experience with SuSE 5.2, none of my DOS or Windows games or applications would work. I could probably have gotten by, but Linux has always seemed like it required more knowledge than its contemporaries. After Red Hat 8's polished graphical interface, several other Linux distributions followed suit and updated their installers with GUIs to make Linux more approachable. Mandrake Linux refined its installer with full graphical menus, easier partitioning, and even better hardware detection. SuSE got YaST 2, their installer which evolved from an earlier text-heavy version to one which was fully graphical and had an easy-to-navigate interface. It simplified partitioning, package selection, and hardware setup, which made installation more user-friendly. In version 6.06 of Ubuntu, included a new installer which offered a simple, fully graphical installation process designed for beginners. It too made tasks like partitioning, package selection, and hardware detection easy and approachable. This focus on usability helped Ubuntu quickly become the go-to Linux distro for new users. Red Hat 8 was a real breakthrough back in 2002. For the first time, installing Linux didn't feel like punishment. The graphical Anaconda installer guided you through the whole package selection and hardware setup, making the process approachable for everyday users. But compared to today's installers, it still required a fair amount of attention and technical know-how. You couldn't just click next and walk away. Modern OS installers like Windows 11 or Mac OS handle almost everything automatically. Drivers are installed on the fly and the system is ready to use immediately or after a couple of reboots. It's fascinating to see how far we've come. What once took hours and careful attention can now be completed in a matter of minutes, even by someone who's never used Linux before. But if it's okay with you, I'll stick with Mac OS. Which Linux installer do you think was a game changer? And what was your first Linux install and how did it go? Let me know in the comments below. Well, if you've made it this far, thanks ever so much for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.